到我的频道，这里是志恒攻略。昨天测试了这个一个音效的配置，喇叭的配置，应该说麦克风的配置比较好，但其实收音效果还是欠佳，因为用笔电游玩游戏造成麦克风限制了它收音的敏感度，所以变成收音的方式一定要把麦克风贴近在发音的位置的地方，而且是非常近，才可以达到勉强我可以接受的声音大小。这样子回到另外一个状况，就是它去配合游戏音效所造成的一个不协调，这个声音落差太大了，这个对游戏的观影感受很不好。有时候有一些游戏的直播主，他不会回顾自己的直播影片，所以就不会发现自己的直播有什么问题。那种就纯粹只是做游戏记录而已。所以有时候做游戏直播还要思考一下直播的定位。这个笔电风扇的问题可能需要调整。那 OBS 的调整的部分，音效我再重新调高，让它的背景音乐变高一些，然后再回到昨天节目的这一个问题是，昨天有使用游戏内的 radio 的一个音效效果。那游戏里面的这一个 radio 的音效效果，可能是因为我压低了这整个它的那个。压低了太多了它的游戏声音，所以这样子造成了一个很大的问题，是说背景的这一个它的收音机效果变得很恼人，因为听不清楚。而且是使用携带装置调到最大收音效果，还是非常的糟糕啊！这个问题就很严重，所以这所有都要调整啊。然后再调这一个radio， 我来看 radio， talk public radio。
That likely loss in Montana. It's in Texas, where Ted Cruz is being challenged by Congressman Colin Allred. There was a New York Times poll out this morning. He's down by 4, but Cruz much tighter there than for comfort, with the abortion law there in the state playing a big role. And I think the biggest surprise of the cycle is actually in Nebraska, where you have Republican Deb Fischer being challenged by independent Dan Osborne. Another New York Times poll out this morning showed her ahead only by 2 points. We have both of those races, a lean Republican. Osborne's a mechanic. He's running as a blue-collar machinist, so he's been able to pick off some Republican voters, winning independent voters, winning Trump voters. He hasn't said which party he would caucus with, so it could be interesting. Let's say that if Democrats are able to run the table, only lose Montana, could it come down to Nebraska if Osborne is able to pull off that upset and which party he would caucus with?
I could keep talking about this with you, Jessica, for many, many minutes, but that's all we got time for. Jessica Taylor is an election analyst with a Cook Political Report. Jessica, thank you.
Thank you.
Last night I attended a pumpkin carving party.
现在这个背景音的调整还需要很多的测试。那现在先回顾一下游戏内的公司营运状况。目前卡车司机来到122人，然后车库27间，卡车124台。现在角色使用的卡车是 International 的9900i， 一台老车哦。不过 International 的引擎声音蛮迷人的。好，看一下司机中介所。好，看起来没什么变化，变化不够大。好，现在继续执行探索任务。录音师的部分剩下一小段了。好的。
Racked up more than 20 million views. She says the best feeling is being taken seriously by other creative people, like when she got a bunch of compliments after finishing Taylor Swift.
I was standing in my kitchen and I just started bawling. It was just overwhelming, the nice things that were being said. And I'm like, they're not being said about my face. They're not being said about, my car. They're being said about something I created.
For this Halloween, Youngblood is sharing her Taylor Swift template for free on her website for anyone who wants to try celebrity pumpkin carving. For NPR News, I'm Elizabeth Caldwell in Sapulpa, Oklahoma.
Why do you get a pumpkin, Steve?
I don't know. When is the A. Martinez pumpkin on the way?
20 more years in this business, maybe then.
Anyway, happy Halloween season. This is NPR News.
In Tulsa, this is KWGS News at 8:19. A Tulsa Public Schools board member is facing criticism for some remarks made at a political meeting. TPS District 4 Rep. Elena Ashley spoke earlier this month at a Tulsa County Republican Men's Club gathering. In a video of Ashley's speech posted to the Tulsa World website, Ashley warns that undocumented students pose a threat to safety.
We don't know their agenda. We don't know their language. We don't know what it is that they have in mind.
Ashley claims more than half of the students in her district who don't speak English may be in the country illegally. The remarks drew condemnation from Tulsa's teachers union. Speaking at a TPS board meeting, the vice president of the Tulsa Classroom Teachers Association said Ashley was not living up to her public service obligation.
I want to remind Board Member Ashley that we have over 34,000 students in Tulsa Public Schools, and she must be concerned about the educational welfare of every single one of them, regardless of where they were born or who they have as parents or guardians.
Leanne Jimenez also read aloud from a board policy prohibiting members from using their seats for partisan gain. Ashley told the Tulsa World she was trying to protect students and educators from being recruited to anti-American ideology. Broken Arrow Public Schools is planning to redistrict its middle schools for the 25-26 school year, affecting nearly 900 students. The change was prompted by the construction of a new 8th grade center and the need to reduce class sizes. You're listening to Public Radio Tulsa 89.5 KWGS.
Issues dividing the country.
Support for Public Radio Tulsa is provided by Green Country Habitat for Humanity, building affordable housing in partnership with families for over 35 years. Information about how home ownership can become a reality for more Tulsans at greencountryhabitat.org.
For NPR comes from the station and from Easy Cater, working to help organizations order food online from a nationwide network of restaurants, with tools designed to help save time and manage food spend all on one platform. Learn more at easycater.com. From Progressive Insurance with Snapshot, a personalized program that bases rates on safe driving habits, at progressive.com. Not available in California or from all agents. From MIDI Health, committed to providing a supported path to symptom relief for women in perimenopause and menopause, offering personalized virtual care. Learn more at joinmidi.com. And from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation at macfound.org.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Steve Inskeep.
And I'm A. Martinez. We're talking a lot this month about managing stress, from politics to climate to personal challenges. Today, we're focusing on one strategy that may help you get to the root of your stress and understand yourself a lot better. NPR's Allison Aubrey joins us. All right, so understanding ourselves better sounds very, very good. So how do you get to the root of stress?
Well, you know, sometimes the source of stress seems like it's right on the surface, especially when you're going through a tough situation. Now, that was the case for Seth Copold. He lives in Michigan, and about 15 years ago, he was going through a divorce.
All right, let's hear from Seth.
For me, the most challenging thing about the divorce was thinking about what will happen to my kids, how much time will I have with them, and what will happen to them when they find out. And I started to get very anxious and actually started having panic attacks.
He remembers this one night. He was driving home, and he had to pull over suddenly. He was short of breath. It was then that his therapist actually recommended an approach that he had never heard of. It's called Internal Family Systems, or IFS for short. And he says it led him to kind of a powerful new way to cope.
And I remember this moment when it really hit me that the anxiety I've been feeling, the intensity, was one aspect of me, but not all of me. And in that moment, I felt this calm come over me.
All right, I'm hooked. Internal Family Systems, IFS. What is it? What do you do?
So IFS is a type of therapy. It's based on the idea that we all have multiple parts within. And the goal is to get to know all these parts or voices. So let me ask you, have you ever felt torn, say, like amid a big decision or a tough situation? You think, oh, you know, part of me thinks I should go this direction, but part of me says, no, you know, hold back.
Yeah, today, at least 3 or 4 times, 3 or 4 different decisions, yeah.
Yeah, it turns out this is normal. I mean, many of us have this part of me language in our everyday life. So the basic premise here of IFS is that we have these parts, some of them competing, and that's what Seth Copold realized.
So I had a worrier part, a critic part, and they were all kind of like teaming up. And I think partially that's why the panic attack often would happen, because this gets so loud.
Now, IFS has been around about 40 years, and there are some studies to show it can be effective, though the field is calling for more research, in part because it's become very popular. I spoke to the founder, a psychologist named Richard Schwartz. He told me Seth Copold's story is very relatable.
When we're rejected or somehow a relationship gets broken, the parts of us that are most hurt by that, we tend to want to get away from because we don't want to feel that pain.
We just want to forget about it, you know, just move on.
Yeah, if I don't think about it right, it can't hurt me. I mean, so right. That's not the right thing to do here?
Well, with IFS, people are told to actually lean into this pain. And this can be very intense at first. When Seth Copold started the process, he recalls a kind of nervousness throughout his body and anxiety-provoking images.
So I had parts showing me like old movies about divorce and showing me like horrible situations that could happen. And I had other parts that would like criticize me for anything I contributed to make this divorce happen.
Now, in IFS, the rule is that none of our parts are bad. Each of them can give us kind of useful information. And Seth Copold, who is now actually trained as an IFS practitioner or coach, came to see that his worrier parts had become too dominant.
And it wasn't until I could ask them to give me enough space that I could actually problem solve it. I could figure out, well, how can we do this so our kids are okay?
And when he asked that worrier part to step aside, he said he realized that he had other parts within that could step up.
They're all chiming in going, yeah, we could like do this with the kids. We could make sure they're feeling safe this way.
So he started to feel like he was in control, he told me, like he was the conductor of all of his parts.
Allison, there are a lot of people in my life that would love it if the worrier part went away. Because
Right?
I'm a worrier, I over-worry, I worry about everything. But a lot of this, to me, right off the bat, sounds like multiple personalities. I mean, is that really the premise that we're talking about here?
Well, this is a question that Dick Schwartz gets a lot, and he got a lot of pushback when he first proposed that we all have multiple voices or little personalities within. But what he's shown over 4 decades is that when people do this parts work, as it's called, many people can get to the root of the pain they carry around, he says. So he experienced this firsthand and talks about his complicated relationship with his father, who was a prominent doctor and researcher.
I'm the oldest of 6 boys, and I think I had undiagnosed ADD at the time, and I just wasn't a good student, and that drove him crazy. And so he piled on a lot of shame, and so I had parts that were stuck back in those scenes where he would say, Dickie, you're good for nothing.
He said the fear and the shame were kind of buried in those parts of him for years.
So it wasn't until I actually invited those parts to really let me feel how bad it was, that I got how bad it was. And then I could actually enter that scene and be with the boy in the way he needed it.
So, this is really about getting in touch with parts of ourselves that may be forgotten or buried. And as for Seth Copold, he told me that IFS helped him understand the root of his anxiety, parts of him from childhood that harbored fears of being unloved.
There's a big difference between, like, I am the anxiety, I am the worry, I am the fear, versus I'm here with the fear, I'm here with the anxiety. And in that separation, there's more of my natural state, which is confidence, courage, compassion, perspective.
And he's remarried now and says he has very loving relationships with his children.
Well, at least it worked out for him. That's NPR's Allison Aubrey. And if you want more ways of managing stress, you can sign up for our Stress Less newsletter. Go to npr.org/stressless. Allison, thank you.
Thanks. Great to be here, Abe.
Support for NPR health coverage comes from Procter & Gamble, maker of Nervive. Nervive Nerve Relief is designed to reduce occasional nerve aches, weakness, and discomfort in hands or feet due to aging. Learn more at nervivehealth.com. And from BetterHelp, committed to helping clients with issues ranging from relationship challenges and goal setting to grief and depression. Learn more at betterhelp.com/public.
This is NPR News.
Support for Public Radio Tulsa is provided by TSET, the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust, dedicated to reducing tobacco use with a reminder that exposure to secondhand smoke is known to cause lifelong health problems and is especially harmful to growing children. More at tobaccostopswithme.com.
Made possible by your financial support. Public Radio 89.5, KWGS HD1 Tulsa.
Good morning. It's 8:29. I'm Zach Bobbitt in the KWGS newsroom. Your Tulsa area weather forecast today: mostly sunny and windy, a high of 89. Tonight, partly cloudy, a low of 70. Coming up, the World Series moves to New York tonight for Game 3 between the Yankees and the Los Angeles Dodgers. It's a battle of two of the most storied franchises in baseball history. That story coming up right here on KWGS.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Dave Mattingly. With 8 days remaining until Election Day, Vice President Harris takes her Democratic campaign back to the swing state of Michigan today.
She was in Pennsylvania yesterday, rallying supporters in Philadelphia. Former President Donald Trump returns to Georgia today. He speaks at a Republican event in Atlanta. NPR's Danielle Kirchleben says comments made by some of the speakers at Trump's rally at New York's Madison Square Garden yesterday are getting a lot of attention.
Comedian Tony Hinchcliffe started the rally with remarks that included a joke referring to Puerto Rico as a, quote, floating island of garbage. Another speaker seemed to imply that Vice President Harris is a prostitute. All told, more than 4 hours of speakers preceded Trump. During his speech, Trump doubled down on recent comments calling some Democrats the enemy from within and suggesting he'd use the military against them.
And when I say the enemy from within, the other side goes crazy, becomes a sound, oh, how can he say? No, they've done very bad things to this country. They are indeed the enemy from within.
Trump is rallying supporters across swing states this week. Danielle Kurtzleben, NPR News, New York.
The Trump campaign says the remark made by Hinchcliffe does not represent the views of the Republican presidential nominee or the campaign. This is NPR News from Washington. Egypt's president is calling for a 2-day ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. The proposal from Abdel Fattah el-Sisi also calls for Hamas to release 4 hostages held in Gaza in exchange for Israel releasing an unspecified number of Palestinian prisoners. An official briefed on the ceasefire talks tells NPR Israel has not rejected the proposal but is waiting for the results of the presidential election in the U.S. before moving forward. Japan's ruling party lost its majority in parliament in weekend general elections. As NPR's Anthony Kuhn reports, the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, has ruled Japan for most of the last 70 years.
Opposition lawmakers beat out ruling party ones 235 to 215, but no party or coalition got a majority in the House of Representatives. Opposition parties won by aiming for the political center and capitalizing on popular anger at corruption within the LDP. Now the parties will have to horse trade to form a new governing coalition. If the ruling party needs the opposition's help to get its bills through Parliament, it may find its hands tied in pursuing its policy agenda. That could affect Japan's efforts to give the U.S. economic, military, and political help in its competition with China. Anthony Kuhn, NPR News, Seoul.
On Wall Street, the Dow's up 280 points. I'm Dave Mattingly in Washington.
You're listening to 89.5 KWGS. The International Gay Rodeo wrapped up over the weekend in El Reno. OPMX's Anna Pope was there.
Dirt flies as horses gallop through the 36th annual World Gay Rodeo Finals in the Canadian County Expo and Event Center. There are 10 traditional events at the World Gay Rodeo Finals, but there are also some you won't find many other places, like a goat dressing contest. Mark Christensen is the rodeo's director. He got into the Great Plains Rodeo Association while in college.
We are about family, and that's one of the things that a lot of folks don't understand, and that's what we are about. We are about family, and we're going to take care of our families.
More than 100 people competed in the event. In El Reno, I'm Anna Pope.
You're listening to Public Radio Tulsa, 89.5 KWGS. Thanks for listening.
The board for NPR comes from the station and from Sony Pictures, presenting the new movie Here, reuniting the director, writer, and stars of Forrest Gump, a tale of love, loss, laughter, and life. Here is only in theaters this Thursday. From Indeed, designed to be an end-to-end hiring solution for businesses of all sizes to attract, interview, and hire candidates, all from one platform. Learn more at Indeed.com/NPR. And from listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Martinez in Los Angeles, California.
And I'm Steve Inskeep in Washington, D.C. Now we have a follow-up to several NPR exclusive reports on crisis in military health care. The Pentagon was trying to privatize and outsource health care for troops and their families. NPR found there's a shortage of health providers nationwide, which has hurt the military's ability to keep its fighting force healthy and even to keep its medics trained and ready. Now there is a start at solving the problem. NPR's Quill Lawrence reports from Charlotte, North Carolina.
David Calloway became a Marine Corps surgeon just in time for 9/11.
He saw the military quickly learn lessons that cut battlefield fatality rates in half.
We need to capture all of these lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan and what they call the war dividend.
Because Callaway later discovered that the military had already learned those lessons in Vietnam and in Korea and then forgotten. He wants to preserve the war dividend this time.
The idea is we've invested trillions of dollars, thousands of lives. We have to take lessons out of this that help our community members in the U.S. and then also help our men and women serving overseas.
Callaway says that is starting to happen with civilian-military partnerships funded by the Mission Zero Act that Congress passed in 2019.
The idea behind this was how do we get to zero preventable deaths from trauma?
Mission Zero collaborations do more than preserve knowledge, they solve a staff shortage.
You stable there.
Callaway is Chief of Crisis Operations at Atrium Health here in Charlotte, North Carolina, where active duty docs and nurses from nearby Fort Liberty come and work shifts, like Army Doc Michael Clemens.
I am a surgeon for the United States Army Special Operations Command.
Clemens finished med school as Iraq and Afghanistan wound down. He's with Special Forces, so he still goes all over the world. But between trips, he ran into what's now a widely recognized problem for military providers. The Pentagon has outsourced so much that he can't get enough practice for his next combat deployment.
It was a very stark contrast. I see appendicitis, I see hernia repairs, and I'm treating those kind of daily processes. All of a sudden, I'm thrown into a war zone where the majority of my patients are now coming in multiples.
Working shifts here in the ER, Clemens can stay sharp and even practice battlefield techniques. One example is a way to stop blood flow at the aorta with a balloon.
That is something we use to decrease bleeding in traumas. That is a skill that has evolved and been used commonly on the battlefield. And so I get to have firsthand experience with that device before I go use it in a more austere environment.
So, well, the important part of what Dr. Clemens is talking about is
Dr. Callaway again.
This device was specifically created because we were seeing so many servicemen and women get their legs amputated in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they needed a way to stop the blood flow. And so this device that was designed to save amputees in war zones is now saving mothers who are having high-risk pregnancies.
Civilian-military collaborations like this are now happening at dozens of hospitals around the country. But here in North Carolina, the partnership got tested this year in a way no one ever wanted.
Today's an absolute tragic day for the city of Charlotte and for the profession of law enforcement. Today we lost some heroes.
That was Police Chief Johnny Jennings last April, on the day Charlotte lost 4 police in a shootout that also wounded 4 others. The casualties went to Atrium Health.
My name is Kathy Barnard. I am the nurse manager here in the emergency department.
Barnard was working that afternoon when the ambulances started arriving.
So, we started getting the calls. Obviously, there's lots of law enforcement showing up.
Here's Dr. Clemens again.
We had, 8 shooting victims that involved a rifle with high caliber wounds. And so when they come into Atrium Health, on call that day were 2 military surgeons fully integrated with our civilian partners.
Everybody had a role. Everybody knew what room they were going to. A well-orchestrated dance.
And I will say the triage officer that day did look to one of my surgeon colleagues who is a combat surgeon and said, hey, I'm going to give you this first patient because we know that you're ready for this.
I pray we never, ever experience that again, but we had the right team here to carry out the amazing care we gave everybody that hit our door that day.
Dr. Callaway worked that day as well on the scene of the shooting and back at the hospital. And he says there's one last thing this kind of mentoring can provide when the immediate trauma work is done. That's to have an experienced surgeon, maybe one who's seen war, be able to tell someone they did everything they could. Quinn Lawrence, NPR News, Charlotte, North Carolina.
Getting credit for a mortgage or some other kind of loan can be a life-changing event. If the terms are good, it can drastically increase your financial power. There was a time when many people couldn't do this at all. Banks could legally discriminate against people based on their sex and marital status. Today marks the 50th anniversary of a law that banned that discrimination. NPR's Netta Ulaby reports.
Here's what happened to Emily Card in the early 1970s when she applied for a credit card through her bank.
I was turned down, they sent me a letter back saying that I could not have a card in my own name, but if I wished for my husband to apply, he could.
That was normal, standard practice, even though Card at that time made more money than her husband. She got a job in Washington, D.C., working for a Republican senator from Louisiana. He helped pass what became the Equal Credit Opportunity Act by tacking it on to another piece of legislation. Card talked about this in an oral history. She said the legal language was simple.
Just a couple of sentences about not discriminating against women on account of sex or marital status. They didn't use the term gender back then.
The law would be amended later on to also ban discrimination based on age, race, and disability. It originally passed in 1974 in a bipartisan landslide.
It meant so much.
That's Elizabeth Babcock. She directs a museum that has not yet opened. The Smithsonian American Women's History Museum should join other museums on the National Mall within the next 10 years. Until then, Babcock's team is assembling oral histories, including Emily Card's, for a project about the history of American women's economic power. It kicked off today to mark the anniversary of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. How easy it is to forget, Babcock says, that not only did married women have to have their husbands' names on their credit cards,
but the credit history, if they were able to get approved, their husband would co-sign it, and the credit history would accrue to him, not to her. So if your husband died or you got a divorce,
your own business, or Nada Ulapi, NPR News.
This is NPR News.
Good morning, I'm Jonathan Fruin at the BBC. The head of the NATO military alliance says the deployment of North Korean troops in Russia's Kursk region represents a significant escalation of Pyongyang's involvement in the war against Ukraine. Mark Rutte also reiterated NATO's support for Ukraine.
NATO allies will continue to support a free and democratic Ukraine, because Ukraine's security is our security. Today we discussed the need to further strengthen military support to Ukraine.
Elsewhere, new talks about a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of hostages still being held by Hamas are taking place in Qatar today. The BBC's Yolande Nell is in Jerusalem.
The Israeli Mossad intelligence director who's been handling this negotiations file remains in Qatar to meet with the Prime Minister, to meet with the US intelligence chief there as well. In parallel to all of this, we have had the Egyptian president putting forward an idea of a 2-day ceasefire as a sort of testing the water measure.
And Indonesia says it won't allow the latest generation of Apple iPhones to be sold in the country. The industry minister said all variants of the iPhone 16 would be banned because Apple has failed a requirement to source 40% of the components from local manufacturers. It said people could still import the phones from abroad, provided they pay the appropriate taxes. I'm Jonathan Fruin at the BBC.
The University of Tulsa Symphony Orchestra presents Our Strength Comes From Our Friends, their season opening concert, which will feature the Enigma Variations by Edward Elgar and The Hero's Call, an original work written by T.U. Malone and School of Music faculty member Joshua Loudon. The concert takes place Monday evening, October 28th at 7:30 at the Work Performance Center, and is free and open to the public. Information at calendar.utulsa.edu.
Support for Public Radio Tulsa is provided by the founders of the Shining Honor Project, enriching the lives of those with developmental challenges while honoring our nation's veterans. Meet and learn about Honor Team members at shininghonor.org/stories.
A listener-supported service of the University of Tulsa, Public Radio 89.5, KWGS HD1, Tulsa.
Comes from the station. And from the Nature Conservancy, working across oceans and isles to cut carbon emissions, protect lands and waters, and support local communities for a future where people and nature thrive. nature.org/solutions. And from your part-time controller, the nonprofit accounting specialists, providing financial management services to support stronger nonprofits who make the world a better place. Learn more at yptc.com/NPR. This is NPR.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm E. Martinez.
And I'm Steve Inskeep. Good morning. Mountain biking is a male-dominated sport. Up to now. More women are riding for fun, though, and racing professionally and taking control of the sport's narrative. North Country Public Radio's Emily Russell reports.
40 female riders inch up to the starting line of a World Cup mountain biking race in Lake Placid, New York. The women sprint down the first stretch of the course, tuck around a tight turn, and then start to climb. This course weaves up and down the side of a mountain. It winds through the woods, up and over big boulders. In about an hour, the men will race on the same course. Kate Courtney, who's one of the top riders in the world, says professional mountain biking is actually designed in a way that promotes gender equity.
We race on the same courses as the men. We race on the same weekend as the men for roughly the same amount of time. So in many ways, the structure of the sport lends itself well to featuring the strengths of women alongside the strengths of men.
But that kind of equity hasn't always translated into equality. The mountain biking industry has been geared towards men for decades. More bikes are made for men, sold by men, and raced by men.
It becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy and cycle in which women are not maybe seen in the sport at the top level, being paid, being able to make it a full-time career.
In a recent survey of the top men's and women's riders, 90% agreed that there was a gender pay gap in the sport. But things are changing. More companies are building bikes for women. More women are racing professionally. Women like Ronja Blochlinger from Switzerland.
I think the women's field developed extremely the last few years, and there are now so many really, really strong athletes, and the level is really high, and that makes it exciting.
Blochlinger rides for Liv, a brand that makes bikes specifically for women. All of its pro athletes are women, and nearly its entire support staff are women, including team manager Elizabeth Walker.
I'm super proud that we have a female team manager, a female mechanic, female chef, a female physiotherapist, and a female technical coach on board with us.
Why is that important to you?
What you can't see if you're listening in is that I'm actually wearing a t-shirt that says, "Everyone watches women's sports."
Thousands of fans are here in Lake Placid watching the women's mountain biking races. A recent global survey of sports fans found that overall, people are watching more women's sports. And more female athletes are telling their own stories, like pro rider Kate Courtney, who has more than 500,000 followers on Instagram.
Honestly, social media has played a big role. I think if you can see it, you can be it.
Courtney created a foundation a few years ago called She Sends. It helps fund and promote women's mountain biking, especially among young girls. Elliot Muir was just a girl when she got into mountain biking in Colorado. She's now in college in Vermont and came over to Lake Placid to cheer on the women riders. Muir says moving through the mountains on a bike makes her feel strong and alive.
I think it can bring you a huge sense of freedom and a sense of flow and also joy and confidence in like the strength that your body has and your capacity to really take on these obstacles.
At a young age will race professionally, but they may gain a new sense of confidence and help close the sport's gender gap. For NPR News, I'm Emily Russell in Lake Placid, New York.
It's NPR News.
Support for Public Radio Tulsa is provided by Philbrook Museum of Art, presenting 200 years of American art in the exhibition American Artists, American Stories. Few works seen in textbooks and Ken Burns documentaries until December 29th. More at philbrook.org.
This is Public Radio 89.5 KWGS at 850. A new study shows more abortions are being performed across the country now than before Roe v. Wade was overturned. But a few states are bucking that trend. The hashtag WeCountReport shows a small increase in monthly abortions nationwide. Only 3 states with bans, Idaho, Texas, and Oklahoma, saw actual declines. Dr. Ushma Upadhyay with the University of California, San Francisco, says there could be a few reasons for the documented decrease.
There may be abortions that are happening in Oklahoma that we cannot account for, that we are not counting.
Researchers say they're waiting for federal data on births to paint a fuller picture. The owner of the Park Center building in downtown Tulsa is suing Dollar General Corp., claiming its DGX store has become a public nuisance and should be closed. The lawsuit, originally filed in state court, has been moved to federal court at Dollar General's request. Park Center building alleges that since the DGX Tulsa opened just before the COVID-19 pandemic, it's fostered a range of criminal activities and negatively impacted the neighborhood, citing 433 police calls in 3 years for serious incidents like robbery and sexual assault. The plaintiff seeks a permanent injunction to halt these nuisance activities. Dollar General denies the allegations, saying it's committed to providing a safe shopping environment. This is KWGS News.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Steve Inskeep.
And I'm A. Martinez. Even for a war as brutal as the one in Sudan, this past week has been one of the deadliest, with hundreds of people killed by bombings and revenge attacks and tens of thousands more displaced. Here's NPR's Emmanuel Akimoto.
Al Jazeera State, just south of the capital Khartoum, was Sudan's breadbasket before the war, rich in fertile land. Now, its fields are soaked in blood. Unverified footage on social media shows dozens of men, young and old, held captive with their hands tied behind their backs. They're taunted and humiliated as they're marched through the countryside by fighters from the RSF. Then in subsequent footage, there are scores of bodies wrapped in bloodied sheets, waiting to be buried. The RSF have denied killing civilians and claim to have only killed people who took up arms against them in their war with Sudan's army. But eyewitness accounts shared with NPR reveal otherwise. This man's name has been hidden to protect his identity as he fears being attacked. He says 2 of his family members were killed, and now he's lost contact with his wife and newborn baby. Close to 500 people have been killed over the last week, according to local activists, and more than 45,000 people have been displaced during the same period, according to the UN. The attacks have been described by many as reprisals. They follow the defection of a senior RSF commander to the Sudanese army. It was hailed by the army as a major blow to the RSF, but just days later, RSF fighters returned, seemingly without any resistance from the military.
There is no words to describe the devastation that is happening in Al Jazeera.
Maha Suleiman is a doctor and works for the Sudanese American Physicians Association, or SAPA. The organization supports medical centers in Al Jazeera State and across Sudan. She said there were growing fears for the women and girls there, amid widespread reports of sexual violence.
There has been killing, attacking, looting, raping, and kidnapping of women, and also children.
When the fighting erupted on the streets of the capital Khartoum last April, thousands fled to Al Jazeera, just south of there, until the war reached them and turned a place of refuge into a nightmare. Emmanuel Akimoto, NPR News.
An independent investigation into the U.S. Secret Service concludes the agency needs reform. Janet Napolitano served as Homeland Security Secretary to President Obama. Mark Phillip served as Deputy Attorney General during the George W. Bush administration. They both reviewed thousands of documents and conducted dozens of interviews as they studied the attempted assassination of former President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, from the roof of a nearby building. I asked Secretary Napolitano about the biggest failures.
The panel found a number of operational mistakes, from poor planning to poor decision-making in terms of line of sight, in terms of protecting the AGR building, in terms of how the communication setup was established. But more important, we asked ourselves the question, what led to those mistakes? And that inquiry really led us to a deeper set of recommendations and reforms that are more systemic that we believe the Secret Service needs to undertake.
And all those things, Secretary, it sounds like it would mean a lack of leadership as well.
A lack of leadership was one of the key findings of the panel, and one of the other key findings was that the service has become somewhat insular, and we believe some fresh perspectives from new types of experiences would be well warranted.
Well, let's get into some of those fixes. Mark, let's start with you on this. What are you recommending?
We think there should be leadership changes, including an infusion of perspectives from outside the Secret Service. Second, a focus on training. There's a very, very small amount of time and resources devoted within the Secret Service to training. That's not fair to the agents who are asked to put their lives on the line. And then third, a hard look, a real focus at what it takes to execute to a zero-fail level on the protective mission, and if that requires shedding other things that the Secret Service has been asked to do over the decades, those should be given to other agencies that are capable of doing them.
In addition, Secretary Napolitano argues the Secret Service needs to upgrade its use of technology and training. In Butler, she says, only one anti-drone system was in use.
And it failed, so they had no redundancy, and it was being operated by a young agent who had no formal training on use of the device.
Hearing both of you mention what you'd recommend, I'm kind of just sitting here in shock that all of these things that you're mentioning aren't part of the day-to-day culture of the place. Mark, is that kind of part of the problem too?
We ask a great deal of the Secret Service. It's a challenging mission, particularly during national election years. The culture does need to become consistent with the zero-fail nature of the mission and what's required. And we hope that in the wake of this report and others, that people will give the focus and resources to the service that allows it to have both the internal and external accountability to discharge that zero-fail mission.
Just wondering, when you were Homeland Security Secretary to President Obama, were you under protective detail by the Secret Service?
I was.
And back then, how did you feel safe? Did you feel like there were no issues when it came to your safety?
I felt totally safe, and I had a 24/7 Secret Service detail as the secretary. And I will say that, we had some operational problems with the service when I was secretary. But what we found in the Butler investigation was something deeper. It was a series of operational missteps and mistakes that really helped uncover deeper cultural and systemic issues.
One of the things that I've always wondered about the Secret Service, Secretary, is that in addition to protecting America's leaders, the Secret Service also investigates a wide range of financial crimes. Shouldn't the...
刚才听的是 Public Radio， 它大部分使用的新闻都来自于 NPR News。NPR News 是美国的大众募资的一个新闻频道，还有部分政府赞助，这跟台湾的公共电视有点类似。那它是不是比较中立？可能要再多看一点新闻才会知道。至少它的资金来源不是企业。可是它现在的 YouTube 的订阅率居然只有52万6千的订阅，这也太少了吧！以一个美国3亿人口的国家的量体，订阅只有52万，根本就惨到不能讲啊！那你就台湾人口放大10倍来说，那52万跟台湾的5万订阅是一样意思吗？是这样讲吗？好像也不是这样讲。好。
A one-stop hub that connects individuals impacted by the criminal legal system with.
而且使用游戏内的电台广播有一个很大的问题是，也不晓得有没有版权的问题。这是做创作人最害怕的问题，用音乐常常都会被卡版权。 那有时候以前没版权的东西，过个几年突然它就变得有版权了，根本就放回马枪，有够危险的。那最怕的是还一次来，就是说哦，你有可能看到有一段时期都爱用某一些音乐，然后它突然变得要收钱了，你根本就措手不及啊！来自于过去的攻击，来自于过去的攻击。这个是什么？最近那个死神梗吗？
To come under attack in this election. Today, we dig into that and ask whether the guardrails in place to secure your vote will be up to the task. If you have questions about the week ahead and what happens after Election Day, we want to hear from you. Email us 1a@wamu.org.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Former President Donald Trump campaigned in New York last night, again promising to deport millions of undocumented migrants.
On day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history to get the criminals out. I will rescue every city and town that has been invaded and conquered, and we will put these vicious and bloodthirsty criminals in jail. We kick them the hell out of our country as fast as possible.
The FBI says its latest data show violent crime is significantly lower in the U.S. Stanford University researchers also report that since the 1960s, immigrants have been 60% less likely to be incarcerated than people born in the U.S. Vice President Harris campaigned in Philadelphia yesterday. She released a video promising to quickly work to improve Puerto Rico's economy. Harris's comments came as a comedian at Trump's New York rally disparaged the territory as a, quote, floating island of garbage. The Trump campaign said that comment does not reflect the views of Trump or his campaign. Gaza's civil defense says around 830 Palestinian bodies were brought to the Kamal Adwan hospital in North Gaza. That was during the start of Israel's incursion there on October 6th until last Friday. NPR's Hadil Al-Shalchi reports.
The Palestinian death toll continues to rise in northern Gaza as more bodies are discovered on the streets and under the rubble, according to the Gaza Civil Defense spokesman Mahmoud Basal. Many of the bodies have been taken to the Kamal Adwan Hospital, one of 3 hospitals in northern Gaza that have been left nearly non-functioning. Israeli troops raided the hospital last week and detained staff for hours, according to the United Nations. The Israeli military said the Hamas militants were among those detained. The World Health Organization said the raid on the hospital left only 2 doctors to care for almost 200 patients. The UN called the humanitarian situation in northern Gaza, quote, catastrophic, with a severe lack of food, water, and other basic needs. Hadil Al-Shalchi, NPR News, Tel Aviv.
Stocks opened higher this morning as investors await news this week on the job market and economic growth. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the Dow Jones Industrial Average jumped about 250 points in early trading.
The Commerce Department reports this week on how much the U.S. economy grew in July, August, and September. We'll also learn how many jobs employers added in October. The monthly jobs report is expected to show some temporary weakness as a result of the Boeing strike and damage from hurricanes in the southeast. Quarter pounders are going back on the menu at hundreds of McDonald's restaurants after a brief suspension of sales due to an E. coli outbreak. Slivered onions on the burgers are the suspected culprit. The fast food chain is set to report quarterly earnings tomorrow. Crude oil prices fell over the weekend after Israel's attack on Iran steered clear of that country's oil facilities. Retail gasoline prices have dropped about 4 cents a gallon in the last week. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
You're listening to NPR. Supporters of the jailed Nobel Peace Prize winner Narges Mohammadi say authorities in Iran have allowed her to go to the hospital. A group that is campaigning for her freedom says Mohammadi has reported feeling sick for several weeks. She won the Nobel Peace Prize last year for her peaceful activism in Iran for human rights. Last week, Iranian authorities tacked on 6 more months to her prison term. Political uncertainty has gripped the former Soviet Republic of Georgia following weekend parliamentary elections. As NPR's Charles Maines reports from Moscow, Georgia's president now says she won't recognize election results that she claims were dictated by Russia.
Georgia's president, Salome Zurabishvili, appeared with key opposition leaders to denounce official results that saw the ruling Georgia Dream Party take 54% of the vote as fraudulent. Zurabishvili accused Moscow of carrying out a, quote, Russian special operation to rig the vote and called for mass protests in the capital, Tbilisi. The election had been seen as central to putting Georgia's European Union prospects back on track after the government embraced seemingly pro-Russian policies and anti-Western rhetoric that placed Georgia's EU candidacy bid on hold. The U.S. and EU stopped short of denouncing the election results outright, but called for a full investigation into alleged violations. Charles Maines, NPR News, Moscow.
Authorities in the Philippines say the death toll from Tropical Storm Trami has now reached more than 100 people. Unconfirmed reports say more than 150 people are dead. Many victims died in landslides triggered by torrential rain. Others perished in flooding. I'm Corva Coleman, NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Cigna Healthcare, a health benefits provider that advocates for better health through every stage of life. Learn more at Cigna.com. And listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
Support for Public Radio Tulsa is provided by Tulsa Ballet, presenting Dracula. This Gothic ballet returns to Tulsa just in time for Halloween, October 31st through November 3rd at the Tulsa Performing Arts Center. Information at tulsaballet.org.
Public radio in HD from the University of Tulsa. Public Radio 89.5, KWGS HD1, Tulsa.
This is 1A. I'm Todd Zwillick, and we start the week with a simple question. Could this happen again?
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
That was in the early hours of Wednesday morning, November 4th, in 2020. Hours after the polls had closed and when President Donald Trump, then the president, falsely claimed he had won. He did it knowing that millions of legitimate votes had yet to be counted. And a half dozen states hadn't yet been called for either Joe Biden or Donald Trump. That set off a cascade of events that culminated in a pro-Trump riot on Capitol Hill on January 6th and an attempt to overturn the Democratic results of the election, for which today Donald Trump remains criminally charged with 4 felony counts. Politico has spoken to dozens of people familiar or involved with the election process this year, and according to their reporting, a consensus has emerged. Not only could Donald Trump make a second attempt to overturn an election if he loses, but the groundwork for doing that has already been laid. And that's where we're going to start with our series, our weekly installment of If You Can Keep It. This is our election series where we leave the horse race to the side and instead focus on the stakes of this election for people, for the country, and for our democracy. Heidi Przyzwala is National Investigative Correspondent for Politico and is with us in the studio. Heidi, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Todd.
Also with us, attorney and a familiar voice to 1A listeners, David Becker, who's been working for decades to improve our elections. David is the executive director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, a nonpartisan and not-for-profit organization based here in D.C. It works with election officials, and its mission is to build confidence in our election. And for that, David, we thank you and welcome to the studio.
Thanks, and great to be here.
Very, very, very glad to have both of you. All right, Heidi, I want to start with this passage from your article because it says a lot, and I'm quoting here. On election night, no matter what the results show, how many votes remain uncounted, and how many advisors tell him otherwise, Donald Trump will declare himself the winner. That's what you write.
Do we know that? Because of the substantial investment that is being made into laying this narrative right now that unless Donald Trump wins, this election has been incredibly fraudulent. And we've seen this narrative being laid for years, Todd, but now there's a much more significant investment in this. When you have individuals like Elon Musk, who commands the biggest platform, the biggest, equivalent of a public square in the United States of America, pushing this narrative, you know that on election night, he will declare victory, and almost know that the earlier he does it, potentially is the indicator that he's actually losing. Because if he really thinks that he is winning, he's more likely to let the process play out, the legitimate process of all of the ballots being counted. But there are several stages to this. Look, it is a very narrow, perilous path that would require an incredible amount of complicity at all levels of the system. It does exist. I'm happy to walk you through that. But given the amount of dollars and also just the entire apparatus of the party now pushing this, you know that this is what is going to happen.
Well, what you're reporting with you and your political colleagues really does is lay out a roadmap for how election night, the days and weeks following it, could go if and when this happens at the local, the state, and the congressional, federal level. I encourage people to read it in the pages of Politico. It really is a very helpful roadmap that will help all of us navigate election night and the time thereafter. David, Heidi and her colleagues have this roadmap for the post-election period. That said, this is 2024, not 2020. Are things different now, even if some of the playbook is similar?
Yes, they're definitely different in some ways better, in some ways worse. Some of the things Heidi just mentioned, the organization that's happened over the last 4 years, the refinement of messages that give the false impression of widespread voter fraud, the money that's flown into this operation over the past 4 years. There's a network of activists that are ready to be activated all over the country in case their preferred candidate loses. And then I think most notably, the fact that one of the major social media platforms is now completely controlled by someone who is 100% invested in seeing Donald Trump elected. And we're seeing the impacts of that. He's become super spreader number one of election disinformation, Elon Musk has. But some things are better. The election officials around the country have been tested, and they have come through every single time. Our system has seen what they've tried. They've tried to deny certification at the county level, for instance. We've seen this effort take place, and every time it has failed. And so I am largely confident. I'll also add the Electoral Count Reform Act was passed in 2022 on a bipartisan basis. It makes it much harder for anyone to subvert the process by trying to deny certified electors that being counted on January 6th. So I have a lot of confidence in that overall process. But Heidi raised, I think, a really insightful point, which is that it is almost guaranteed that Donald Trump will declare victory on election night. We can say that with almost certainty. And we should really listen and watch to how that happens, what time it happens, and the words that come out of his mouth. It's almost certain that at the point he does that, nobody will know who actually won. We probably won't know that until later in the week.
Because we probably won't have final results on election night, Pennsylvania, other close states.
Right, and we won't have final results anywhere. It's just that the margins in some states will be so narrow that the media can't call them. We've never had final results on election night ever in our nation's history. It's just we've had margins like Ronald Reagan in 1984, where it didn't take very long to count the ballots to the point where we could say who won. But watch Donald Trump on election night. Watch what time he calls it, and watch how he calls it and what he says at that moment. If he says something like, we're watching the process, we believe we won, I'm expecting a call from Vice President Harris, we're looking forward to the next 4 years, like we would expect any normal candidate to say, he probably is seeing data that indicates he won. But if he instead says, the mail ballots were fraudulent and non-citizens voted and the voting machines are rigged, and he goes into his greatest hits of disproven conspiracy-oriented claims of the last 4+ years, then I won't be able to know whether he actually won or not, but it'll indicate that he thinks he lost at that point, and that'll be telling.
Heidi, David is talking about sowing doubt and all of the investment in sowing doubt of election results, which may or likely to happen. You say going to happen on election night if Donald Trump loses or thinks that he lost. In fact, he's been sowing doubt for the last 4 years. This has been an ongoing process. You also talk about the importance of building pressure on state and local officials, building political pressure on them, even if they don't have the legal authority to refuse to certify. This is about mounting pressure on them. Talk about that.
We know that he will do this because past is prologue, and he did this.
In the past election in 2020, he actually called up Board of Canvassing members in Michigan and strong-armed them. So now one of the differences, however, is that you do have some county officials who have proven that they may be willing to be complicit in this. Now, to David's point, you also have elections officials who are not elections deniers at the highest levels who are willing to take them to court and compel them to certify. And so you have a good check there. But to the narrative, it doesn't matter if what you're doing here is not a legal strategy, but a kinetic strategy. And the goal is to kick up enough uncertainty and chaos at the local level that you give a pretense for a Republican-led legislature to say, we can't certify, this election is questionable and there's been fraud, and to give them kind of that pathway to say, as opposed to 2020, where none of the legislatures backed these slates of fake electors, to have a legislature be complicit again. I'm going through like the worst case scenario of what would have to happen here. But so let's say theoretically, then you have a legislature that's willing to go along with this and to send an alternate slate of electors. Then you get to Congress, and the Republicans would have to hold the House, because hold the House. If Democrats take over, this is not going to happen because they will brush it aside.
So what you're talking about is sort of a cascading effect of political pressure that builds from local and state officials up through the system. There are deadlines we'll talk about. They end in Congress, of course, on January 6th, which is the date that everybody's familiar with now. I want to just give voice to how intent Donald Trump appears to be, to sowing doubt yet again.
Will you accept the results of the election, regardless of who wins? Yes or no, please.
If it's a fair and legal and good election, absolutely.
If it's a fair and legal election. Last week, Democratic candidate Kamala Harris told NBC how she might respond if her rival again tried to claim victory on election night.
Last election, the former president came out on election night and declared victory before all the votes were counted. What is your plan if he does that again in 2 weeks?
Well, let me say this. We've got 2 weeks to go. And I'm very much grounded in the present in terms of the task at hand, and we will deal with election night.
So you have teams ready to go? Is that what you're saying? Are you thinking about that as a possibility?
Of course.
David, as we head into a break, does that sound to you like signals to a system that is ready to withstand this pressure?
I have an optimism about the system being able to withstand this pressure legally, that the winner will take office. I am concerned about the chaos that could be created and the violence that would result from that.
We're going to talk more about that. That's David Becker, Executive Director at the Center for Election Innovation and Research. Heidi Przyzbala is here from Politico. We heard this from one listener who says, I'm getting tired of questioning every little thing about our voting process. 10 years ago, everybody was confident in the process. Nothing's changed. Now we have people questioning the pens used to mark ballots. Well, you can weigh in too. Email us 1a@wamu.org. You can call us 855-236-1A1A. Much more from Heidi and from David, and a check-in on Lancaster County in hotly contested Pennsylvania, where accusations of fraud have been swirling around registration there. More soon. I'm Todd Zwillick. This is 1A.
I'm Scott Tong. In her new book, law professor Melissa Jacoby says our bankruptcy system is making the country more unequal.
Black Americans pay more for bankruptcy relief and get less debt relief. And then the rules about debt and assets are skewed toward a white family.
Next time, Here and Now.
This afternoon at 1 on Public Radio 89.5.
The nonprofit Will Rogers Stage Foundation welcomes legendary blues guitarist and 5-time Hall of Fame inductee Elvin Bishop back to Tulsa. He'll be performing in the historic Will Rogers Auditorium at Will Rogers High School at 3909 East 5th Place, Sunday afternoon, November 24th at 2:30. All seats are reserved and advance tickets are recommended. Tickets available online at willrogersstage.com.
Support for Public Radio Tulsa is provided by Green Country Habitat for Humanity, building affordable housing in partnership with families for over 35 years. Information about how home ownership can become a reality for more Tulsans at greencountryhabitat.org.
National Public Radio for Northeastern Oklahoma from the University of Tulsa. Public Radio 89.5, KWGS HD1, Tulsa.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from JTV, Jewelry Television, a TV shopping network offering a range of color gemstone jewelry, including tanzanite, turquoise, and ruby. Available on TV or at jtv.com. From BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy. Clients are matched with one of 35,000 therapists and can communicate via video, chat, or phone at betterhelp.com/public. And from listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
Welcome back to 1A. I'm Todd Zwillick. We're here with Heidi Przyzbala, National Investigative Correspondent for Politico, and also David Becker. David is Executive Director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and we're talking about what we can expect after Election Day. Heidi's reporting in Politico has been looking at where the process is likely to come under attack and from whom, and David has spent years working with election officials to make sure they have a plan in place and can respond to a range of expected challenges. And we've been hearing from you as well. Tim in Carlisle, Pennsylvania says, this is my 54th year of voting as a Republican, an independent, and a Democrat. My wife and I live in a rural township and vote at our township office. 2 weeks ago, I asked the clerk how the staff was doing in preparing for the election and whether they had received any threats. She said they were very, very busy, had not been threatened, and would be glad when it's all over. Whether I'll be glad when it's over remains to be seen. I think we all share that sentiment, and I'm glad nobody in your rural township in Carlisle, PA, has been threatened. I think some election workers in other places can't say the same, but Tim, thanks for that message. Heidi, your reporting with your colleagues in Politico also talks about the importance of lawsuits being filed in various states. They've already begun. There are, to my knowledge, more than a dozen in North Carolina, other places too. Lawsuits meant to challenge votes, lawsuits meant to engender delay in the process. Talk about why they're being filed in this way and what's important here.
You know, history rhymes, doesn't repeat, but what we saw as well in 2020 was this very organized effort, almost templated lawsuits that were filed in multiple states, making the same allegations, for instance, around Dominion voting machines. Well, we're seeing something very similar now, and it goes back to the narrative that was being laid in advance that our system is so fraught, for instance, that there are tons of illegal voters who've accessed the system and could be affecting election results. Now, all of these are being pretty much dispatched with, but people could come back to them after the fact. And again, this is not about actually presiding in a court of law. This is about creating this narrative that, number one, convinces people that there was fraud and so that there will be some kind of rebellion. We don't know what that looks like, Todd, and that is the part that I think we haven't been talking about enough as a society, which is no one knows specifically where the challenge is going to come from, but we know it's going to happen, and we know most likely it's going to happen around allegations, false allegations of illegal voting by immigrants, for instance. And what we saw, for instance, was in Michigan, this is literally what happened, was a Republican volunteer from out of state in Texas staked outside the voting center in Detroit, and she said that she saw a case of ballots being ferried into the counting center in the middle of the night. She was in her pajamas in her car, and she tweets this out. The president, the former president's son, then tweets it out, and now you have a narrative that ballots are being ferried in the middle of the night into a vote counting center. Well, it turned out that that was camera equipment, but it was good enough to set the narrative. And the thing that we don't know right now is where it's going to happen, who's going to take some kind of false video of ballots being taken in, or of people who are of a certain ethnicity voting and being accused of not being legal citizens.
David, what Heidi is talking about with lawsuits is not necessarily the legal merit, whether they will prevail in court, whether they will disqualify ballots here or there, but the construction of ongoing narrative, using the legal process to forward the narrative of a stolen election, whether it be around undocumented immigrants voting or some other narrative. Can you talk about the legal process in that context and what you expect?
So in 2020, we should think back. It's hard to put ourselves back there, but we were in the middle of COVID, 1,000+ people dying every day, no vaccines. People were scared. We didn't fully understand how the disease was communicated between people. And election offices were trying their best to accommodate voting, a very social activity in an era where we needed to be socially distant. And there was a lot of pre-election litigation over those adaptations that were being made. And largely that was legitimate. I mean, whether you like the decisions or not, there was some need to clarify these things that were happening. And Republicans won 85% of pre-election litigation in 2020 going into the election. Then they had an incredible run of losses post-election because they had no shred of evidence to justify any of these false claims. And in fact, as we sit here, nearly 48 months since that election, there has still not been one shred of evidence presented to any court in the country that would cause any of us to doubt the outcome.
As we sit here, the lawyers who brought that non-evidence to court, many of them have been charged with crimes. Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Ken Chesbrough, John Eastman, all the lawyers who were putting these frauds before courts for various reasons have been charged with crimes. It doesn't appear that the Trump campaign is going to have that caliber of lawyer this time, though.
Well, I mean, let's put aside the relative caliber of the lawyers. They did have a remarkable run of 60+ defeats in the post-2020 period, and many of them have been disbarred or suspended from the practice of law, so they couldn't help the Trump campaign even if they wanted to. And even when people like Rudy Giuliani or Carrie Lake were accused of defamation and had the truth as a defense in their claims, they conceded liability rather than present evidence that what they said was true. Fox News famously settled their lawsuit for nearly $800 million in the same way. What we're seeing now is a little different, and I think Heidi's touched on this, which is that a lot of the lawsuits pre-election are being brought, at least on the Republican side, not to actually win. They're frivolous lawsuits. They've been brought too late. They don't have any evidence or legal basis on which to rest. But they're being brought because they are setting the stage to claim an election was stolen afterwards. And we're going to hear a lot of the same claims, the non-citizen voting, the voting machines, mail ballots being fraudulent. We're going to hear those in the post-election period, particularly if Trump loses. And that's why we're seeing them lose so many of these pre-election litigation. I do think this is not a strategy designed to succeed. This is a strategy designed to incite anger, to incite violence, and very importantly, to incite donations from the sincerely disappointed supporters of the loser. Heidi.
Yeah, Todd, going back to what I witnessed outside Detroit's TCF vote counting center was that place felt like a tinderbox. There were people who were trying to get in who had no business being in there. They were not official election observers, and yet there was a feeling that they had been sent there. Well, it turns out part of the evidence that came out of Jack Smith investigation into the election was that there was an aide inside the center who said, who had been told that it was becoming a tinderbox outside, and he literally said, make them riot. This is a concern because there is not the election security infrastructure in terms of policing at every single little county board and counting center. And if you have people, not the instigators, but actual, citizens who've been going to these rallies and being told that it's your patriotic duty to confront your legislators or during certification or go to the vote, stop the vote count, people really believe what they're being told. A lot of question about whether the people who are doing the lying actually believe it, but there's certainly a market for it. And there are people out there who are extremely exercised about this and are being told that it's their patriotic duty to stop the count.
You're both talking about the incentives of lying about the election, maybe not a strategy, David, as you say, designed to succeed, that it's unlikely to succeed in overturning the election if indeed that's the aim. but talk a little bit more about the incentive of stirring up this kind of unrest that Heidi is talking about from outside of Detroit. We saw it elsewhere as well. We saw Trump campaign officials in the last election on the record, on paper, saying, yes, make them riot. What's the purpose of that chaos?
Yeah, and we should note that at that moment, and Heidi alluded to this, there were 200 observers representing campaigns, political parties, inside, on the other side of that door at the TCF Center while that was going on. And one of them was one of the people who contacted the outside folks to try to get them to riot. So the transparency was there, but they were selling a false bill of goods about transparency while it was happening. And we're seeing this happen all over the place. I mean, the incentive structure is out of whack right now, where up until recently there were no repercussions, there were no consequences for this activity. We're starting to see this. That's really important. From the top level with former President Trump being charged, and all the way down to these it was very rare, but there were a couple of election officials. One was Tina Peters in Colorado, who allowed herself to be corrupted and kind of engage in some of these conspiracy theories.
And who we've covered in detail on the show, was just sentenced to 9 years in jail.
Exactly, just recently in the last few weeks. So we're seeing that change to some degree, and we're seeing some of the guardrails strengthened. I really think that the Electoral Count Reform Act and what's happened since then, it's been in the law for 2 years now. It has not been challenged. If anyone thought it was unconstitutional, they could have brought it beforehand. I think that's going to be a problem if anyone tries to claim that.
We're going to talk a little bit more about the Electoral Count Act and what happens when eventually, under the Constitution, these votes do reach Congress, and they will. It's January 6th. It's always on the same day. You're familiar with that date now in America. We got this question, though, from Dean, who says, what about the increased plausibility that Trump's claims of winning are true? Given the much narrower poll margins this time compared to 2020, won't it be harder for people to believe this time and easier for Trump to make his case, even if it's a lie? If the election's closer, this lie's easier, right, David?
I don't think the margin matters much at all. I mean, look, this is a man who has claimed that he won California. There's some shamelessness to some of these claims. This is a man, the first person I've known in American history who claimed an election he won was fraudulent, that there were all these unfound popular votes that he didn't get. I don't think the margin matters at all. I think all that matters for him is power and all of the benefits that come with it, particularly since he's being charged right now. So I would expect that the margin's not going to make a difference.
But a close margin makes the media narrative easier to take hold. It doesn't change whether Donald Trump is likely to lie about it, but it might change how strong the legs of that lie are.
I think one of the things we've all been challenged with over the last several years is it's not all of the supporters of Donald Trump who believe the lie. Certainly not all of them are insurrectionists. The vast majority are good Americans who voted for a losing presidential candidate. Who doesn't understand that? That's the most American thing ever. Everyone in the country has voted for a losing presidential candidate. But there is a core of individuals that will believe him no matter what. And they're substantial enough to cause, to incite anger and violence, and that is a real concern. But what I get asked often is, what's the strategy here? What are they trying to accomplish? How are all these pieces going to fit in place? So even if he loses, he has his hand on the Bible on January 20th. And what I tell them is, there is no strategy here. This is a desperate and somewhat pathetic strategy that cannot yield that particular benefit.
So back to process. We've talked a lot about narrative and how important it is, David and Heidi. Back to process for a moment. Heidi, your reporting reflects how important it is for Donald Trump to have Confederates, allies at the local and state level, and even in Congress. He had some before. He had other people like Rusty Bowers, who is the conservative Republican Speaker of the Arizona House, who Donald Trump called personally to get him to overturn the election, appoint fake electors, and Rusty Bowers said, no, not interested. How many Rusty Bowers are there out there right now, especially in swing states?
We're about to find out, but the problem is that at the local level, there are already some of these boards who've said, we're not going to certify. They're being challenged in advance, but this tells you that, yes, there are going to be some individuals, and maybe more of them at the local level, who are willing to go rogue. But the good news is, and David will agree with this, that at the higher level of certification and overseeing the elections, we don't have this bench of election deniers that could have taken control but didn't in the last election. And so can they delay things? Can they gum things up by taking things to court and playing chicken with constitutional deadlines for certifying things and getting everything done? Yes. And can they create chaos and create this narrative? Yes. But at the end of the day, we are confident, based on what I've heard from folks, including David, your expert here, that they will not prevail. When we talk about the narrow path, though, the question right now is there any Republican-led state legislature that is going to be willing to go rogue and endorse electors who do not reflect the popular vote in their states? Luckily, thanks to the Electoral Count Reform Act, now governors, it's been pretty clear that the governors are the ones and who have the final say of sending the electors in. So even if we look at state legislatures, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, which have Republicans in both chambers, you've got Democrat governors in a lot of those states, right? So again, we can get into the House, but that's the first kind of choke point. And I think understanding that landscape hopefully eases some fears of like what would have to happen initially for us to even get to the House.
I'm all into easing fears. I'm down with easing fears. On the other hand, not to contradict Heidi, but here's another fact. Election denialism is a ticket to entry to the Republican Party now, to Donald Trump's MAGA Republican Party. This is not 2018 or even 2021 where some people were still on the fence. Republicans of good standing who want to have a future say the election was stolen. How does that factor in to state legislatures who controls them and whether they will be willing to fulfill the law and appoint electors? David?
Look, I think everyone agrees that the post-election period is going to be precarious, that there are going to be a lot of powerful forces, if Trump loses, trying to undermine the will of the voters and to incite anger and violence. But I'll take a step back to each one of these steps. The county certification challenges are going to happen. We know this. They've already laid the groundwork for this. But we've also seen the actors in the states. Of the 7 swing states, there are 2 Republican secretaries, one of which is Secretary Schmidt in Pennsylvania, who was appointed by Democratic Governor Shapiro, the other being Raffensperger in Georgia. There are 2 independent election commissions in North Carolina and Wisconsin, and there are 3 Democrats. In the swing states, there are 5 Democratic governors and 2 Republican governors, both who have already withstood these tests. So I'm confident that the electors will be ascertained correctly on December 11th for whoever those people voted for in the states.
That's David Becker, Executive Director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. Heidi Prisbala of Politico is here. We've been hearing from you as well, concern from one listener in Indianapolis who says, no, I'm not satisfied that the vote will be secure. There is always fraud. The question is whether the level of fraud is acceptable based on the fact that elections are conducted by humans and we are not perfect. Every precinct in America needs a full slate of precinct officers, Republicans and Democrats. And we got this from Kathleen, who says, for about the 5th or 6th time, I will be an Allegheny County, Pennsylvania poll worker. If you want to have confidence, volunteer as a poll watcher. You'll never doubt it again. Speaking of Pennsylvania, after a quick break, we go to Lancaster County, where investigators have uncovered evidence of pretty large voter registration fraud. More on that after a break. I'm Todd Zwillick. This is 1A. Suggested as many as 3 in 10 Americans believe Joe Biden wasn't legitimately elected president in 2020. That's despite all the work that fact-checkers have done debunking that claim. Nowadays, verifying what's true and what's not is big business. Ahead of Election Day, we're offering you the chance to put your questions to a team of fact-checkers. That's next hour on 1A.
The nonprofit Horton Records presents the 11th annual Rock and Folk and Chili Cook-Off Saturday, November 9th at 5:30 p.m. at Tulsa's Cain's Ballroom. General admission tickets and a limited number of reserved tables are still available for this all-ages, family-friendly event, which will include live music from the Paul Benjamin Band, Jesse Acock, Costi, and more. Tickets include all-you-can-sample chili from Tulsa area restaurants and food trucks while supplies last. More information at HortonRecords.org.
Support for Public Radio Tulsa is provided by Philbrook Museum of Art, presenting War Club, Native Art and Activism, the culminating exhibition from artists Anita and Yakata Fields, delving into Native artwork from important historical and contemporary moments of resistance. More at philbrook.org.
This is listener-supported public radio from the University of Tulsa. Public Radio 89.5, KWGS HD1 in Tulsa.
Support for NPR comes from the station and from Insperity, providing HR services and technology, from payroll, benefits, and HR compliance to talent development. Learn more at insperity.com/HR Matters. From ARM, committed to delivering innovative, advanced computing designed to enable worldwide companies to unleash the capabilities and experiences of AI. The future of AI is built on ARM. ARM.com. And from listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
Welcome back. It's 1A. I'm Todd Zwillig. Back to our conversation in just a moment. But first, we'd love your help with Wednesday's show. You've probably seen quite a few pink ribbons this month, a symbol for breast cancer support and awareness. Former First Lady Betty Ford first began to raise awareness after her diagnosis in 1977, and then in the 1980s, an official campaign kicked off to promote women getting mammograms. In the ensuing 4 decades, though, it's become a corporate endeavor, taking over everything from airline travel to sporting events. Well, on Wednesday, oncologist and cancer survivorship expert Dr. Stacey Wentworth joins us to talk about her new podcast, Less Radical. It's about how the man who revolutionized breast cancer treatment nearly became lost to history. And we want to hear from you. How has breast cancer affected your life or the life of someone you love? We'd be honored to hear your stories. You can call us 855-236-1212. What does breast cancer treatment look like for you? If breast cancer runs in your family, how has treatment evolved over the generations? And what do you think of all the pink that takes over in October, including at the World Series sometimes? You can call us 855-236-1212, or you can also leave a message with our app, 1A Vox Pop, and we'll get to your stories here on 1A on Wednesday. Let's get back to our conversation about what to expect after Election Day. Heidi Przyzbala from Politico is here. David Becker, election expert, is also here, executive director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. We want to take you to Pennsylvania, though, where there's been allegations and, in fact, evidence lately of sizable voter registration fraud. We're talking Lancaster County, where a criminal investigation is now underway. That's after election workers found 2,500 voter applications they suspect are fraudulent. Lancaster County is famous for its Amish communities, and it's regularly votes Republican. Demographics there are shifting, however. Carter Walker is a reporter at Vote Beat Pennsylvania. Carter, great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit more about what investigators think they've uncovered in Lancaster.
Yeah, so Friday, the district attorney here in Lancaster, Heather Adams, she announced that 2,500 voter registration applications had been flagged by the county's election staff as possibly suspicious. Her detectives started looking into these, and they found some addresses that weren't right, fake personal information, Social Security numbers that didn't match the name on the application. And they're still working through to investigate all of those, so it's not exactly clear how many of those 2,500 might be fraudulent, but certainly a good deal of them likely.
Well, given how important Pennsylvania is going to be the final outcome, there's a lot of attention being paid to how that vote will be counted. Also, Allegheny and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania's two largest counties. You found a big disparity, though, in how quickly those counties both counted the millions, or at least hundreds of thousands of mail-in ballots during the 2022 midterm elections. What's being done to address it in those counties?
That's right. We looked into how quickly counties around the states were able to count their mail ballots since we got universal mail voting here in Pennsylvania in 2020. And what we saw was pretty interesting, that Allegheny County which is fairly similarly sized to Philadelphia, they were able to count ballots about twice as fast as Philadelphia in the 2022 election. And it seemed to come down to the envelope opening equipment that Allegheny uses versus Philadelphia. They use much faster equipment, and they also have a lot more people doing the work. But Philadelphia has recently opted to use some of the quicker equipment that they have, so hopefully that will speed things up.
Donald Trump has said that Philadelphia is a city where, quote, bad things happen when he's talking about the vote. What has the city done and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania done in recent times to push back against that attack?
Yeah, Donald Trump has definitely been pushing that line a lot the past couple of years, not just this year, but of course a lot in 2020, where that line came from, his bad things quote. But it's not just him. You know, the city has been maligned for years as a place that just can't be trusted when it comes to elections. Recently, though, city and state officials, they've really been trying to increase their transparency, show how the process actually functions. They've been doing a lot of media interviews, trying to push back actively against misinformation. I saw just last week the Republican city commissioner there, Seth Bluestein, was pushing back against some disinformation that Elon Musk was amplifying on X. The Secretary of State as well, who you mentioned, Al Schmidt, he was a city commissioner in Philadelphia in 2020, so he knows this issue well. He's been doing a lot of media interviews, and not just media interviews as well. He's been doing some public events where folks from around the state can come and asking questions about how elections work. So they're really trying to be at the forefront of telling people, hey, this is how it functions. If you have questions, come ask us.
All eyes on Pennsylvania, critical swing state, and the importance of a free and fair and clean information environment in my home state of Pennsylvania. Carter Walker, reporter for VoteBeat Pennsylvania, reporting from Lancaster County. Carter, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, back in the studio, Heidi and David. Carter mentioned the disinformation in Pennsylvania also being amplified by Elon Musk. You have both mentioned him already in this conversation. How important, Heidi, I believe you mentioned when in Detroit, when a claim of, oh, I saw people with a box carrying ballots, and it got retweeted by Donald Trump's son. The situation now is that Elon Musk has been amplifying messages like this. We saw it in the recovery of Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, taking conspiracy theories, amplifying them to 200 million Twitter followers, riding the algorithm sees it. How important is Elon Musk's participation in a disinformation campaign going to be?
In countless.
这电台是发生什么事了？直接被静音吗？消音了，完全没声音呢。So cool 哦。 它的广播完全静音了。结束了吗？
Next time on 1A.
Oh, 原来如
When
此。
Katrina Spade learned how much
它会突然断
cremation
线呢。
pollutes the planet, she decided to come up with a different burial method.
It was definitely like a light bulb moment. There was no question in my mind that we could compost humans.
Stories and ideas about what lies beneath. That's next time on the TED Radio Hour from NPR.
Today at noon on Public Radio 89.5.
Support for Public Radio Tulsa is provided by the George Kaiser Family Foundation, partnering with Family and Children's Services Women in Recovery Program, an alternative to incarceration for women dedicated to changing their lives and the lives of their children. More at fcsok.org.
Public Radio 89.5, KWGS HD1 Tulsa.
First rule of reporting, get your facts right. Well, nowadays, with truth under assault, fact checkers have never been needed more. But who are they? How do they work? From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A. I'm Todd Zwillick. Solid journalism rests on the facts. Immutable proof that something exists or happened or was said. But what does it mean to get your facts straight and to verify information in this era of spin and lies and made-up stories? That work could not be more important right now. So we've lined up fact checkers to answer your questions. It's our Ask a Fact Checker conversation where you get to do just that. You can email us 1a@wamu.org. But first to Hollywood, 1A's John Horn has been talking to Jesse Eisenberg about his movie A Real Pain that's out on Friday.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. This is the final full week of campaigning before next week's general election. Former President Donald Trump returns to Georgia today for an event in Atlanta. Vice President Harris takes her campaign back to Michigan, as NPR's Asma Khalid reports.
Harris is making a couple of stops in Michigan to highlight the administration's work to boost American manufacturing. She's visiting a semiconductor facility that received an investment through the CHIPS and Science Act. That law was passed on a bipartisan basis with the goal of reducing American dependence on foreign semiconductors. But last Friday, Trump blasted the law, describing it as a bad deal, and said he could have imposed tariffs to get more companies to build CHIPS facilities in the United States. Harris will also visit a labor union training facility, and this all comes as some progressive Democrats have called on her to focus more on the economy in these closing days. Asma Khalid, NPR News.
Trump held a rally in New York last night. A guest comedian called Puerto Rico a, quote, floating island of garbage. There's been a lot of criticism. Puerto Rico's Republican Party chair called the comment racist. Trump's campaign released a statement saying the comment does not reflect the view of Trump or his campaign. Meanwhile, Trump is promising to cut taxes on tips, overtime, and Social Security, and this weekend, he floated the idea of cutting all federal income taxes. NPR's Luke Garrett reports Trump's running mate isn't so sure about that.
On Sunday, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance called the elimination of federal taxes, quote, aspirational. During an interview with NBC's Christian Walker, Vance argued tariffs on foreign countries could fund the federal government instead of taxing citizens. When pressed on whether he thinks ending income taxes is possible, Vance relented.
Is it on the table with the Democratic Congress that we have? I don't think that's realistic, Kristen, but I do think it's good to set an aspiration of what you want the country to look like.
So you don't rule
and
it.
Right now we're working on cutting taxes on tips, cutting taxes on overtime.
Tax experts say these cuts would severely increase the country's national debt. Vice President Harris also supports eliminating taxes on tips. Luke Garrett, NPR News, Washington.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte says he can confirm North Korea is sending troops to Russia, and they've been deployed to a region where Ukrainian soldiers have recently taken territory. That means the North Korean troops could enter combat against Ukrainian troops. Rutte says North Korea has given Russia more than troops.
Pyongyang has already supplied Russia with millions of rounds of ammunition and ballistic missiles that are fueling a major conflict in the heart of Europe and undermining global peace and security.
Rutte says Russia is giving North Korea military technology and other support to get around international sanctions. This could mean a threat to South Korea. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrials are up about 300 points. This is NPR. President Biden released a statement yesterday observing the 6th anniversary of a gunman's deadly attack on a Pittsburgh synagogue. The gunman killed 11 worshipers from multiple congregations and injured 7 other people. He was sentenced to death last year after he was convicted on 63 charges, including hate crimes, resulting in death. McDonald's says Quarter Pounders are returning to its menus following an outbreak of E. coli in 13 states. The food poisoning sickened at least 75 people and 1 person died in Colorado. NPR's Ava Pukac reports.
McDonald's says testing from the Colorado Department of Agriculture has ruled out beef patties as the source of the E. coli outbreak. The Food and Drug Administration says it believes the contamination likely stemmed from slithered onions from a single supplier. McDonald's says the onions came from the Taylor Farms facility in Colorado Springs and were distributed to 900 McDonald's restaurants across 12 states. The chain says it has stopped sourcing onions from the Colorado Springs facility indefinitely. Restaurants that had received onions from the Colorado Springs facility will resume sales of the Quarter Pounder without slithered onions. Ava Pukac, NPR News.
A British cheese distributor says a con artist has stolen nearly 50,000 pounds of award-winning cheddar cheese. The high-quality cheese is worth at least $400,000. Detectives at Scotland Yard are helping search for the thief. Officials say nearly 1,000 wheels of cloth-wrapped cheese from 3 makers have vanished. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, supporting books, radio, podcasts, film, television, theater, and more to bridge science and the humanities. And the listeners who support this NPR station.
Support for Public Radio Tulsa is provided by TSET, the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust, dedicated to reducing tobacco use, with a reminder that more than 30,000 Oklahomans are exposed to secondhand smoke at work every day. More on the benefits of smoke-free work environments at tobaccostopswithme.com.
A listener-supported service of the University of Tulsa. Public Radio 89.5, KWGS HD1, Tulsa.
This is 1A. I'm Todd Swillick. A Real Pain is the name of a new movie that not only stars Jesse Eisenberg, but was written and directed by him, too. Eisenberg plays David, and Kieran Culkin plays his cousin, Benji. Now, David is fussy and controlling. He's a killjoy. Benji is the opposite, raw and unpredictable. And when the two travel to Poland to honor their late grandmother, their differences explode. The film's title has 2 meanings. In David's way of seeing his cousin, Benji is a real pain. But as David comes to understand, Benji is deeply troubled, and the pain he feels is, yes, real pain. Here's a clip from the film soon after David and Benji have joined their Polish tour group.
Look at her. Oh, and that woman, Marcia. She's walking alone. We should go talk to her.
We just met her.
Yeah, maybe she's got this, deep sadness behind her eyes, you know?
She does?
Yeah, you didn't notice that?
During the introductions? No. I
think we should check on her.
Benji, maybe she wants to be alone.
No one wants to be alone, Dave. Okay, I'm gonna check it out.
No one wants to be alone, that's what Benji says, and he means it. A Real Pain has been a big hit on the film festival circuit. It opens in theaters on Friday. It's Eisenberg's second time behind the camera. 1A's entertainment correspondent John Horn sat down with Jesse Eisenberg recently, and he joins me now from Los Angeles. As always, John, great to see you.
Todd, happy to be with you, and happy to be talking about this film, which I really love.
Well, tell us about it.
Well, I am one of 4 boys, and as I suspect is true in many families with multiple siblings, there are specific roles we play in that family, even if it's not exactly the role we wanted to play. So one idea, and maybe a big idea behind this movie, is who are our true selves, especially in relation to other family members, and how did that person who might have had one role to play in childhood evolve or change? Kieran Culkin's character, Benji, talks in the movie a lot about how he misses the person that David was when he was a kid. because Benji thinks that that was the true version of David. He was emotional and frail, but also interesting. So this is a story about family dynamics, but the thing they have in common is a grandmother. Because she's no longer alive, it's not as if they're dealing with somebody who is present in their lives.
Well, you asked Jesse Eisenberg about the genesis of this story, and here's what he told you.
I've been writing screenplays since I'm 18, but they never got made. When I was younger, then I switched to plays. I switched to plays when I was like 22. The first play I wrote took place in Poland, and Vanessa Redgrave played my surviving cousin, and I was in it playing a character named David. And so I've been writing around this movie in kind of adjacent storylines for almost 20 years, and then this one came about because I had written this short story that took place in Mongolia about these two guys, similar dynamic, who go to Mongolia because I wanted to shoot a movie in Mongolia. I was trying to adapt it into a movie, but I just kept hitting a dead end. The screenplay was going nowhere. I couldn't find the real second act of it, where after this interesting thing happens. And as I was kind of banging my head against the wall, an ad came up on my Safari browser that said Auschwitz tours, open parentheses, with lunch, close parentheses. And just those 4 words, Auschwitz tours with lunch, just summed up every weird thing that comes with everything I'm interested in, which is like modern life, reflecting on horrors, while also trying to maintain your kind of middle class, comforts. And I thought, oh, that's just amazing, because what you can do with a movie that's set on a Holocaust tour is really just focus on the characters, and you don't have to spell the themes out, because the themes are in the background physically. And so it just gave me this shortcut into writing a character story that can have so much behind it without having to spell it out.
And it gave your character a profession, which is the person who creates those pop-up ads or monetizes them, or is in some way responsible for all those annoying things that pop up on our computer screens. But in a way, it becomes circular, because that is the idea for the film, is what your character would have been pitching, I guess.
Exactly that. Yeah, that's so astute. And truthfully, I'd never thought about that until this moment. In addition to the Bible mention, you're a very astute viewer, and I wish I could take credit for any of this. Yeah, but I maybe unconsciously, there's something about ad banners that just seems pretty, like you don't have to tell a full story to understand the person who's selling them.
So Jesse Eisenberg, John, in real life, talks just about as fast as he did when he was playing Mark Zuckerberg in A Social Network. Can you talk a little bit about the performances in this movie?
Also, he's the one person in the world who uses Safari as his web browser.
I noticed that.
No, he sounds like the guy at the end of a car commercial. Is like, subject to financing, you're rich. Listen, Daniel Day-Lewis, you go see, Lincoln, you're like, Daniel Day-Lewis, maybe that is Lincoln. You don't say that with Jesse Eisenberg. You say that's Jesse Eisenberg. But, his kind of personal neuroses, his way of speaking is so inherently a part of this character that it feels incredibly natural. It doesn't look like you're watching Jesse Eisenberg. It looks like you're watching this character who resembles Jesse Eisenberg a lot, if that makes sense. And Kieran Culkin is also great, and they're great together.
Well, I want to talk about Kieran Culkin a little bit. People will know him. He starred as Roman Roy in Succession, another actor whose manner of speaking and frenetic delivery really had a great deal to do with who the character was in Succession. Here's what Jesse Eisenberg had to say about Kieran Culkin when you talked to him.
He tried to drop out of the movie 2 weeks before we started, because again, he does not like leaving his family, and so he tried to, while we were setting up shot lists in Poland, where $1 million is being spent on pre-production or whatever, he's thinking of dropping out. And so it's just lucky. I mean, lucky. In the wrong hands, the movie wouldn't have had the pathos. In the wrong hands, the movie wouldn't be funny and buoyant the way it is because of him. And so I just noticed that he was great, and just again feel like lucky. Oh, this movie will work because the dynamic works.
100%. Your character, for the first 20 minutes of the film, is a spectator, not a participant.
Yeah.
And he's a spectator when everybody is, with the statue. But he becomes a participant on this train when they're hiding from the conductor. And there's a sparkle in your character's eyes for just a moment where he is the person that he envies and the person I think he wants to be. Exactly. Is that how you pictured that scene?
You described, I think, probably word for word what the script says. is that we push in on David as the, it says as a nostalgic smile grows on his face. It's that. He's remembering the person he was when he was at Benji when they were younger, and he's also trying to feel the thing for just briefly that Benji feels, which is a lightness.
John, I want to go back to Jesse Eisenberg's description of Kieran Culkin just for a moment. He used two phrases there that caught my ear: funny and buoyant, and also loaded with pathos. I mean, that was his character in Succession, was both those things, hilarious and deeply troubled. Do we get a similar Kieran Culkin here?
Yeah, and the premise, and Jesse kind of references that, the premise is they're part of a large tour group that is touring. And Kieran's character is misbehaving. He's doing things that maybe you wouldn't want to do, and Jesse's character is behaving too much. And that scene on the train is when Jesse's character starts to do something a little naughty, and that's where they become siblings more than they are cousins. They're shared in how they see the world and how they behave.
Well, Jesse Eisenberg talked to you about trying to shoot a film in Mongolia, his striving to shoot films overseas. This film was shot in part in Poland, including at a World War II death camp. And you asked Jesse Eisenberg about one location where the cousins are walking across a bridge.
There's a moment in the film, and I don't know if this is a happy accident or you found this or you created it, where David and Benjamin are walking across a bridge, and underneath the bridge is a photograph of that city as it had been.
Exactly.
And it almost feels, I mean, this is how I interpret it, that these are characters who are revisiting that past as they're kind of walking through it.
Exactly.
Tell us about that location and that bridge and that.
I'm so glad you noticed it, and it's like the one thing in the movie I'm like, oh, I wish people actually noticed that. But
it was noticed. Other people in our group noticed it.
Oh, that's
it
good.
was noticed.
On the gondola? Okay, that's good.
Yes, on the gondola.
So,
I'm dead serious. Yes.
Oh, this is great news. This is great news. Okay, it's having the effect I need. Essentially, like, part of this movie, well, I was writing the movie in New York City. I write at the library, New York City Public Library, and I just sit on my computer for months at a time, and I was on Google Maps basically writing this movie because I'm on Google Street View. Like, oh, they would go here and they would go into this street. And so it was pretty tightly scripted about the locations. And then we were scouting in this town, Lublin, which is this really great kind of college town in the southeast of Poland. We noticed this thing. We noticed this mural painted on the bottom of a walkway. It's so hard to describe because I don't exactly know. It's kind of on like a canal, but the canal is dry, so you just see this big mural of what a typical street looked like in the Jewish community in Lublin 100 years ago. And it's the one shot that lasts like a little too long in the movie because I'm kind of an impatient person, as you could tell by the runtime. And so it was like, that was the one shot of like, we just have to keep it going for a longer time.
Well, without doing spoilers, John, what's the significance of that shot under the bridge on the canal for you?
It's just a beautiful shot, and it's really about how their past has become their present. And the reference to the gondola, I saw this film at the Telluride Film Festival. You go up and down from venue to venue in a gondola, and everybody was talking about this film and noticing that bridge, and that's why I kept saying it was referenced in the gondola. It's a visually arresting film. When they go visit the death camp, the way that Jesse shoots that scene is really moving. And then they go to the bus and they have lunch.
This film going to be in wide release soon, John?
It will be coming this Friday. It'll be kind of platformed where it starts in a few cities and then goes wider after that. And I'm hopeful we'll be talking about it as we get deeper into award season. Also, great interview with Jesse Eisenberg, the new issue of The New Yorker, which I highly recommend.
That's John Horn, 1A's entertainment correspondent. John speaking with Jesse Eisenberg about his new film, A Real Pain, also starring Kieran Culkin. It opens in theaters this Friday, November 1st. John, as always, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Todd.
Well, coming up.
Margaret, the rules were that you guys were going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on.
The role of fact checkers in our political lives and beyond. We'll take your questions in our Ask a Fact Checker discussion. You can email us 1a@wamu.org. In an era where the lies come fast and furious, and indeed the disinformation is the strategy, what's the role of fact checkers today? I'm Todd Zwillick. This is 1A from WAMU and NPR.
When Katrina Spade learned how much cremation pollutes the planet, she decided to come up with a different burial method.
It was definitely like a light bulb moment. There was no question in my mind that we could compost humans.
Stories and ideas about what lies beneath. That's next time on the TED Radio Hour from NPR.
Today at noon on Public Radio 89.5.
When you really value something, you support it. And there are so many ways to support Public Radio Tulsa. You can become a contributing member. You can donate an unwanted vehicle. Or if you're at least 70 and a half, you can make a qualified charitable distribution from your IRA. When discussing your plans this year with your financial professional, consider making Public Radio Tulsa a beneficiary of your IRA distribution. Support for Public Radio Tulsa is provided by the Arab Film Fest Tulsa's double feature event, a Palestinian doc about film and TV star Hayam Abbas, and a Sudanese drama about regional divides, a singer and her maid, November 9th at the Circle Cinema. More at circlecinema.org.
From the University of Tulsa, this is Public Radio 89.5, KWGS HD1 Tulsa, made possible by your financial support.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Progressive Insurance with Snapshot, which monitors safe driving habits to determine a personalized rate at progressive.com. Not available in California or from all agents. From Made in Cookware. Made in Cookware is crafted by chefs for use in restaurants and home kitchens around the world. Their cookware can be found at madeincookware.com. And from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, helping NPR advance journalistic excellence in the digital age.
I'm Todd Zwillick. This is 1A. There's an old piece of advice in newsrooms. It's one that every young reporter has heard. It goes like this: if your mom tells you she loves you, check it out. Oh, sure, it's a little cold, but you get the idea. In its best form, reporting exists to get those facts and present those facts. But what about an era where political campaigns flood the zone with falsehoods so that by the time you debunk one lie, 10 more are out the door and on the internet? What about a campaign where politicians aren't shamed by lying, but boast about how effective the lies can be?
If I have to, create stories so that the American media actually pays attention to the suffering of the American people, then that's what I'm going to do, Dan.
Republican vice presidential candidate Senator J.D. Vance last month on CNN talking proudly about why he made up false stories that targeted Haitian migrants in his own state. In an environment like this, checking the facts is a bigger challenge than ever. It's also more important than ever, and that's why we're here with another installment of our Ask A series, in which we invite you to pose your questions to people in all sorts of occupations. Today, it's Ask a Fact Checker. Joining us are Brooke Binkowski, senior editor at the Times of San Diego and former managing editor of Snopes.com and TruthOrFiction.com. Brooke, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Also with us, Wudan Yan, founder of the fact-checking agency Factual. Wudan, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, great to have you both. Wudan, you do mostly pre-publication fact-checking. What does that mean on a daily basis? What do you do?
Yes, so pre-publication fact-checking refers to assessing the quality and veracity of the facts before any story, any podcast, any documentary goes out the door and then is widely available for public consumption. This is how I was trained in the last decade of my career, and to me this is sort of the gold standard with regards to fact-checking, especially because it prevents the propagation of lies. And so when I get a story or podcast episode or documentary installment for fact-checking, I get a Word doc usually of every single fact that's annotated, meaning that it is connected to its, hopefully, primary sourcing. And what I go through is look up all that sourcing, make sure none of the facts are taken out of context, and propose suggestions for accuracy where it's necessary. So, you know, the day of a fact checker, I can be doing a deep dive into how the Supreme Court has traditionally ruled on cases regarding tribal sovereignty. I can be doing a deep dive into early adolescent psychology. I can be doing a deep dive into like weird sounds that emerge from the depths of the ocean. So the day-to-day is pretty varied, but that's at a high level what it entails.
So you're helping journalists, editors, podcasters, whoever, get it right before the information goes out the door. If they want to have a credible source, they want to have a credible article, credible magazine, credible podcast, you're there for a fee to help them do that. Now, Brooke, you've been a debunker, which is what you might call post-publication fact-checking, chasing falsehoods, I think, chasing lies a lot of times, usually around the internet. How is it different from what Wudan describes, and on a daily basis, what do you do?
Well, that's more of what we do was more of an open source kind of free-floating narrative debunking for anybody who saw something that looked a little bit odd or off or just a straight-up lie. You know, I mean, there's all these corrosive narratives floating around right now in our political system. So we were trying to just kind of provide a counter to that, and we also would do our best to find primary sources and connect them to what people were saying others were doing or saying. So our kind of goal was to provide friction for these narratives that were just kind of just kind of galloping around unfettered on and offline. So very similar, and there's a lot of crossover, but also kind of a difference. It was kind of like we felt that we were the ones who were being outsourced to as more and more news organizations axed their fact-checking departments. We realized that we had to provide something that was very visible and very accessible to people in order to counter a lot of the narratives that we're getting I keep saying were, like it was the past tense. I guess I'm an optimist, but those narratives that are just still floating around.
Past tense, as though it's gotten better. Brooke, I want to talk more about the friction that you and your colleagues in your industry are able to provide in a world where disinformation is the message in a lot of cases, especially on the internet. But this is our Ask A series, Ask a Fact Checker. We got this email from Jonathan in Maryland who says, how can fact checkers help when so many people distrust the sources being cited? It's great to be able to say the government announced X or political candidate said Y, but how does that help if people simply won't accept information that does not fit into their worldview? It seems like you can map every single idea to its origin, and many people would simply dismiss the source as untrustworthy to begin with. Wudan, do you want to take a crack at that? When people read an article that's been fact-checked, are they less likely than before, because of established narratives, to even accept the truth claims of a fact-check article?
Well, first of all, I want to say, and pardon my German Shepherd barking in the background,
well.
You get both of us, is that readers and consumers of media don't typically know when a piece of media that they're consuming is fact-checked, because pre-publication fact-checkers like myself often operate in the shadows, and it is still not a newsroom standard that fact-checkers are credited appropriately. But so I would say, you know, the other thing about how the question was framed, that like so-and-so said X, that is true, right? Like we can trace back to a transcript of a speech or so on and so forth, that politician X did indeed say something. But then as a fact checker and as a journalist, we kind of have to provide context around this claim. So we can debunk it, but then, you know, like I think one of the biggest things that I do as a pre-publication fact checker is like, you know, as a standalone quote, this isn't false, but we do need to qualify it and explain it, that like, oh, maybe, you know, the study did find that 20% of students did whatever, but it was a really small study, and we need to say that so we give the public more tools to understand the conditions by which this quote-unquote fact was discovered.
Wudan, how likely, I don't know if there's an answer to this really, the average news consumer, I mean, it's not free, the service that you provide, and I think it's also true that fewer and fewer people are reading the high-quality, especially long-form type of journalism that is routinely fact-checked in places that have the money to pay for it. What percentage of news consumers, when they read stories or listen to podcasts, are getting content that's been vetted in this way?
Well, I know that, a great proportion of nonfiction books are not independently fact-checked. You can probably count on old school magazines that have a print edition to probably most likely still be fact-checked. And for newspapers, oftentimes some people on the copy desk are asked to double as fact-checkers, although I would argue that copy editing and fact-checking are two very different roles. And so it's variable. I would say podcasts, you can fast forward to the credits and listen to see if somebody lists a fact checker. Like I said, most newsrooms do not credit fact checkers or anyone behind the scenes appropriately. And for books, read the acknowledgments. Like that's unfortunately a thing I do now when I'm at the bookstore. I'm like, this looks really interesting. Was it fact checked? Because what happens when I read a book is that I get excited and tell all my friends. And then, if I'm not making sure that the book was the author and the author's team did due diligence in making sure that their facts are accurate, then I'm not doing a great job by stopping the propagation of potential lies.
Ask a fact checker, 1a@wamu.org. You can ask two experts here on the show with me now. Jay emails to say, at my university library, we use the term lateral reading, the idea of reading multiple sources instead of just one. I fooled entire classes with news stories from The Onion, despite how easy it is to look up The Onion on Wikipedia and discover that it's satire. Brooke, you're nodding. You say friction against the torrent of misinformation that's out there. I see you as quite a small knight with a very small sword against a very big dragon that is the algorithm and the incentives for disinformation online. Am I too pessimistic?
Yes and no. And I would also just like to say, as a lifelong nerd, I very much appreciate that analogy because that's kind of how I feel a lot of the time, only it's sort of an army of trolls, right? I just want to address the previous question really quickly. Sure. A lot of the stuff in the public sphere is not done, or we weren't doing it specifically to convince anybody. A lot of this, the worst narratives that are floating around there are being used not to convince or persuade people, but to give the worst people who are listening or who are reading or who are hearing about it, to give themselves permission to do the things that they want to do, to say the things that they want to say anyway. It's a permission structure. So that was what we were doing. We were trying to provide friction for this permission structure so that it would not get encoded into policy. Sometimes we succeeded. And then as far as your next question goes, a very small sword, a very small horse, and I am a very small knight. It's true. But if you know where to go, if you know where to cut, if you know how to stop this feedback loop that characterizes a disinformation campaign, because after a while, when you're operating in the public and you see how the public works, and again, this dovetails a lot with the other sort of fact-checking, but when you're in the public sphere and you interrupt that loop, if you go up against one of the disinformation purveyors and you say, I know what you're going to say next, because this is a narrative that you've used before, and you say it publicly enough, sometimes you can interrupt it completely. I also, go after people in other ways. I try to write about them in advance. I try to do pre-bunking and so on, so I can point to it later. That is incredibly effective, and you would be amazed at how just a handful of people, there were just like maybe 10 of us at Snopes, there were 3 of us at Truth or Fiction, and we made waves, we made big differences just by going up against the liars and saying, hey, you are a liar and we can prove it.
I'm surprised.
好，今天直播就到这边。现在地图的总探索已来到90.68了哦，怀俄明州98.68，快要完成了。怀俄明剩一些细部的探索要完成。大部分都在选。格兰 兰德艾兰。其实这沿路的景观点都可以处理掉啊。那一趟其实是有时间的。Oh my god！ 明天大概就可以把夏安结束了，然后维尔明就差不多结束了，然后再来是内布拉斯加 Nebraska。这样看起来，内布拉斯加的路线都很直啊，南北的路线也都是很显眼的。这就是一个平原州，没有山的关系啊。怀俄明的山在某些地方有，像这里科迪这一边，这里还有这边有一点。在这边杰克逊一直到埃文斯顿这边都有山。博兹曼、比欧特，这些点都是山路。海伦娜中间这里不是很确定，但米苏拉的这一侧就真的都是山了。这一块的州界应该是跟山峦有关的。然后这边切的是爱荷华州，爱达荷。我又在自创名词啊！这个州吗？爱达荷。后面的游戏如果地图全部玩完的话，会考虑去载一些没拉过的货来补足这个部分。这个有很多种货，之前 DLC 买齐了以后，又出现了很多种货物没拉过。因为之前在玩加州，还有内华达跟亚利桑那3个州的时候，几乎把那个时期能拉的货全部都拉过，还刻意去找，没出现还刻意去买拖车来拉。什么货都拉过。现在蒙大拿的货种类又更多，所以快完成了。等到这里完成以后，接着应该会德州、堪萨斯州跟奥克拉荷马。这3州可以再买起来再玩，然后 加州的3州看可以延伸到俄勒冈跟华盛顿，大概这样。那这边就不做延伸，北达科、南达科那边可以延伸，这边再延伸。目前的预计大概这样。那堪萨斯、科罗拉多、新墨西哥州、犹他、爱达荷州，有可能这个游戏以后都不会买这几个 DLC 吧？坚持不通航，算了，这什么坚持？好，晚安。